This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another sensational episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Joel, how are you tonight?
Doing well. Sitting around in my A-frame tank top, loving life. Hearing like Dallas is getting a little less hot, so that means we're in the upper 80s.
That's good. Yeah. My body's sort of starting to feel a little bit weary from the heat, but whatever. That's neither here nor there. But tonight we're going to be talking about a topic that Joel and I've kind of talked about tangentially fairly recently, but then we're going to talk about the topic of forgiveness, and I think this one should be quite interesting. We're going to have some interesting thoughts on this. Yeah, raise the roof. In 2006, a pretty well-known story. This one I'm going to make reference to. But in 2006, a man named Charles Roberts, he went into a schoolhouse in Amish territory in Pennsylvania, and he ended up shooting 10 girls at the schoolhouse, and he killed 5. Now, then he killed himself afterwards. And with very little delay following the tragedy, the bereaved, the parents of the girls who were shot, began to offer forgiveness toward him. And there were even some families who went as far as to attend the burial of Charles Roberts, the assailant, and consoling his wife. And I mean, just really, really outrageous, remarkable stuff that you don't hear about very often. And so, kind of with that as a bit of a backdrop, Joel and I want to explore the topic of forgiveness. I mean, what the Amish people did there, while initially very, very impressive, is probably controversial too. It raises questions. Why would you do that? Is that the right thing to do? What other options would people have that would be viable in that situation? So we're going to ask questions tonight, like when should we forgive one another? Is it always good to forgive? What is happening when we forgive someone? What is forgiveness? What might be costs of unforgiveness? And might we also try out alternative terms instead of, or at least alongside of, forgiveness? So this should be educational tonight, I think. Joel, why do you think that having this conversation about forgiveness is important?
It's very important to me, and that story that you shared is a great example of the complexity of forgiveness, because there's both, as you kind of like alluded to, there's inspiration and admiration that happens with this kind of impressive, I think that's the word you use, impressive act. But there's also like questions going, what is that? Are you really processing your emotions? What is the process from getting to this crazy act that just happened, and then days later you're doing this very almost feeling like inauthentic act? Are you grieving at all? Do you not feel anger? So I think this is an important topic to tease out what happens between forgiveness and unforgiveness. But to your question, why is this important to me? It's the cost of resentment. That's the reason. Sometimes there's a quote on the internet about the dangers of unforgiveness. I was like Googling it, and Joyce Myers kept coming up. I knew the quote that was the original quote, but apparently Joyce Myers has this quote that says, harboring unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping your enemy will die, which I think is a great quote, but it's not the original quote. It's not original to her. Original is a book I read by Anne Lamott called Traveling Mercies. It's a fantastic book. She is on the margins of Christianity and may not even consider herself. She kind of like barely considers herself a Christian. I've seen her speak at some conferences, and I just love her book. She's kind of like harebrained in her creativity. But what she wrote in Traveling Mercies in this chapter on forgiveness is she said that not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die, which I think is so much better. It's slightly different and infinitely better. And that's why I think this conversation is important. Whatever forgiveness is, whatever we define it is debatable. What's not debatable, in my opinion, is the impact of not forgiving, what resentment does to us psychologically and physiologically.
Mm-hmm. Right. Joel, how would you define forgiveness?
So again, this is debatable, and I'm going to borrow a term that
There's
I
only
learned.
one right definition, and it's a right or wrong answer, by the way. So with that in mind, continue.
So I'm going to just admit that I'm wrong. Then there's only one right answer. I'm not sure I'm hitting the bullseye on this one, but I am going to rely on a clinical psychologist that I was introduced to when I was in seminary in a class on pastoral counseling where we dealt with academic psychology and counseling tactics and techniques. And I read several books from this man and was introduced to his definition. He studied forgiveness, and we'll talk to him about him a little bit later. But he divided into two phenomenon. And the first is an action. Forgiveness is a decision. It's an action. And he defines it as making a decision about how you intend to act towards someone who's harmed you or offended you. I'll say that again. Making a decision about how you intend to act towards someone who's harmed you or offended you. The second definition we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah. Good stuff. I appreciate that. And so with that, I mean, I would offer a few things. Just talking about sort of the range of connotation here when we talk about forgiveness. It was when I asked you to define forgiveness and there's only one right answer. It's kind of a ridiculous thing to say because every word has sort of a field of meaning and connotation, and a lot of it depends on the context. It depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what part of the country or world you're in. When I think about, so I might think about sort of what comes to mind when I think about forgiveness, and this might be true for some people too, but I think about like the financial connotations. So the forgiveness of debts, that has been a big topic in our society in the past like year and a half. Student loan forgiveness. You owe something, and that which you owe is going to be erased from the record in a sense. It's no longer really considered a meaningful responsibility that you have, that you're expected to do. I think about forgiveness in terms of some people think of it in terms of sort of like letting go of your anger and hatred toward a person or persons. So that would be another aspect of it. So I think we could say more about it. That's probably a pretty good. I'd say both of what we've said was sort of narrow the repertoire a little bit when it comes to forgiveness. Joel, so we'll probably in this podcast we'll talk a little bit. I don't know that we're going to get too personal in this, but we both have experiences, and everybody has experiences about opportunities for forgiveness to one degree or another. So we will talk about how some of our experience sort of colors the way that maybe we think and feel about these things. But Joel, how have you seen forgiveness work toward healing? And toward that end, maybe you could say a little bit more about Everett Worthington's story, a real important character in this discussion of forgiveness. So, how have you seen forgiveness work toward healing?
So, yeah, the psychologist I was referring to was Everett Worthington, and he was maybe one of my first academic perspectives, but on a more personal level, I experienced a lot of what I would call resentment management when I was in a 12-step program for a long time. We talked a lot about resentment and acceptance. And the word forgiveness was used, but the word acceptance was more used. So I want to put those two words, forgiveness and acceptance, close to each other.
Hmm.
That what forgiveness really is getting at is accepting reality. Because when there's unforgiveness, what's actually happening underneath the hood in the engine is a resistance to what has already happened. This shouldn't have happened. I don't like what happened. I don't want that to have happened. If I could go back, I would do this differently. Or they should, there's things that consequences that haven't happened to this person that I would like to add, in terms of moral judgment and punishment. And the psychologist that we referenced to, Everett Worthington, I studied his work in a class I took in seminary on pastoral counseling. We studied a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy in that class, CBT, and it's a common way of engaging what's often called talk therapy. But he has done a lot of research around this area of forgiveness. And he talks about forgiveness as two things. I mentioned a decision, and
Hmm.
the second would be a feeling. So the first was the decision of forgiveness, making a decision about how you intend to act towards someone who's harmed you or offended you. And that feels very straightforward. And I think that's important. We're not like getting into the squishy world of feelings. We're like defining actions, how I intend to act towards someone who's harmed me or offended me. The second he calls emotional forgiveness. And this is when I replace negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other orienting emotions, other oriented emotions. We might call this reframing. And this is a lot of work, honestly. When I was a pastor, we did this in our small groups. We used some of his curriculum to help people think about this. And honestly, people did not receive it well. It was too challenging for most people. If people aren't prompted by deep pain that is happening to them because of the unforgiveness that they're holding onto, if they're not experiencing the pains of drinking the rat poison, then a lot of people aren't going to be super incentivized to try
Hmm.
and find a way towards emotional forgiveness. So, what I would call emotional forgiveness that goes beyond decisional forgiveness, it's when we transform our state of being. It's not just a decision I make, it's a feeling I began to conjure and create for myself, a generative feeling that I create for myself that changes my state of being. And he uses a model that is extensive research about it, honestly. He uses the acronym REACH, REACH. R is recall, remember the hurt that was done to you. This may be small, large. It could be some mean words to outright physical sexual abuse. E is empathize. Try to understand the viewpoint of the person who wronged you. Why might they do that? What happened in their life? What happens in their mind that would justify them acting in this way? Trying to get in their shoes. The A is an altruistic gift. How can I give a gift that you don't deserve? This makes sense to a lot of parents who have young children. We just love them. They have not contributed anything to our family. They don't work. They don't like bring in money. They're not doing chores. They're just a Slavic dependent 2-year-old. But we give them gifts. This is altruistic. We give it to them because we love them, and there's no other reason. And so that's what he's asking in this reach model, to give an altruistic gift of offering forgiveness. And then C, to commit. Make a commitment to forgive, because that decision, especially if someone's hurt you or wronged you, is not going to stay static. Oh, I forgive them. And we just live in forgiveness. No, our ego is going to show up. Our hurt's going to keep popping its head up and making us want to remember how to resent them. And then H is the hold, how to maintain that forgiveness over time when those things keep happening. He is a lot of street cred too. What I love about Everett Worthington, he's not just an academic who's talking about ideas that are pie in the sky. In the midst of his research, he had already started this research about forgiveness, but in 1996, his 76-year-old mother was murdered. Someone broke into her house and murdered her. And this brought his research to home. Like, do you really believe this, Everett Worthington? And there's actually, the journalist who wrote about this, he and his siblings came out to say, we forgive this murderer. Now, there might have been some pressure. I can't get into their story of Everett and his siblings about their elderly mother who's murdered, what was actually happening when they said that they forgave the murderer. But there was emotional fallout afterwards, because a couple years later, his brother committed suicide. And there was a definite link between his suicide and his mother's murder. And this drove Dr. Worthington to not only study emotional forgiveness, which was put to the test. He was put to the test. Does my research work for me? When my mom gets murdered, does this work for me? But then he saw his brother, it not work for him. And it led to him to study not only emotional forgiveness beyond decisional forgiveness, but what does self-forgiveness look like too? Because there was some of that at play with his brother.
Well, a lot of good insights and good content there, Joel. So I want to take this in two different directions. The first, just I want to follow on from that and add my 2 cents, just to say that I've noticed how the expression of genuine remorse. So this is now I'm talking about in the context of forgiveness. When you have the person who wronged somebody else, the person who's at fault, when that person expresses genuine remorse and maybe even does something to sort of repair the wrong done, if that's applicable, that act of remorse toward the person who then is like the victim of that person, then the victim offering verbal forgiveness. I think, I've seen this be true, and I've witnessed it in my own life, that really has this great power to remove the sting and weight of a wrong done. Now, not always, and not always immediately, but there is something about somebody, even if somebody can't, somebody gets angry with you and says horribly insulting things or whatever, that can't be undone. We can't rewind the clock. But when that person shows that they have considered what they've done, they know they've owned it, and they express genuine remorse, man, it's just amazing to have somehow then when you can think back on that event, it takes that memory gets transformed in a way, whether that transformation is just that it gets muted, or your psychologist might talk about sort of integrating it rather than having it split off. It gets integrated into your life in a way that doesn't feel like you're still stuck there. That's a very powerful thing. Now, we have talked about this before, and I've alluded to it in previous podcasts, but I disavowed in a previous podcast, I disavowed the term forgiveness in my own parlance.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, for me, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have an application for it. And you've said some things that have kind of changed my mind a little bit, but I would rather use other words than forgiveness in certain instances. Um, one thing I'll say right now, because you were talking about the action side and then like the feeling side. One of the things that I think upsets me about forgiveness is how what I might call like the tyranny of forgiveness. And that tyranny is the people, the people and the pressure from society to forgive somebody, whether you are ready to do that or not. Now, in this instance, I'm not saying that forgiveness isn't a good place to be able to get to, but that journey might take, in the case of Amish people, if indeed it was genuine, I can't be the judge of that, it might take 3 days or it might take 30 years. And I don't think anybody can really, we can make observations, and we might be in a place after we've earned the trust of somebody to say, hey, you might want to consider forgiving this person. But what irritates me is, like, if I'm sharing a story with people, and I'll say, like, this happened and I'm frustrated about this, when I am told that I need to, like, forgive and move on, oftentimes what I think is happening is people are saying, whatever emotions you're experiencing, Trent, make me feel uncomfortable,
Yep. Yep.
and you need to be done with those emotions because I don't want to experience them. And
Yep.
that's their way of getting me to shut that down, versus
Mm-hmm.
somebody who, a trusted friend who's walked the road, who's suffered with you, and that person who can say, you know what, look me in the eye and say, Trent, I heard everything you say. I've walked this journey. You need to start thinking about forgiving that. Like that kind of, that real sort of like eyeball to eyeball. You need to forgive that person because you're not doing the right thing, and this is causing you to be torn up inside. There's a big difference between that and the
Yep.
person who just hears your story for the very first time. And like, well, why don't you forgive that person? I'm like,
Yep.
why don't you fucking go shut up and never talk to me again? Or I can just be like, hey, I've just added one more name to the list of people I'm
Yeah.
going to try to forgive someday.
Oh, Brother Johnson. How about that? Double birds.
So anyway, but so okay, then within this context of sort of my beef with forgiveness, you're going to say some things about this. I'd like you to present to people the term, a real important term, a really interesting one, which I'd never heard before. And that term is spiritual bypass, which comes from John Wellwood's book, Toward a Psychology of Awakening. Now, would you define this term spiritual bypass and talk about why it is a problem?
Yes, I will do that. But just for those who may have not listened to previous podcasts, Trent, would you be willing to be vulnerable here and share a personal experience where this is applied to you regarding your dad?
Well, yeah, I've told this. I've shared with certain people the experiences that I had with my father, and um, frustrations there, and how
He
my
went to
father,
jail.
yeah, my dad who went to jail,
Yeah.
and I've talked with people about sort of the problems that I've had in that relationship, and I was telling that story once upon a time, and I had someone that I was telling that story to, basically right after I got done sort of like bearing my heart, which, I mean, I could have not done, and which
Yeah.
is not an easy thing to do. I just kind of bared my heart, and this person said, "Don't you think that it's time to forgive this person?" And what was weird was, why did this person assume that I had not forgiven this person? Their assumption is that if you still have emotions about something, that you haven't forgiven, and you've just talked about that. You can forgive. Forgiveness is a process. Oh, I
Mm-hmm.
forgave that person. Oh, now I feel angry. Well, you can't
Yep.
feel angry. You've got to
Yep.
move
Yep.
past. No, you can forgive a person and still have emotions. Or there can be things that were never sort of resolved that are still part of the present, and all these kinds of things. This person was a good person. They are a good person, but they missed the boat because they hadn't they just didn't know what they didn't know what they were talking about. They hadn't thought this through. They didn't have the capacity to be useful in this situation, and that's fine. But these are growth opportunities, and this is why I think it's an important discussion, because I think we can all help each other more if we think more about these emotional realities, and we develop some skills of knowing how to talk to people who are sharing with us in a very vulnerable way.
Yep. Yeah, I think about this in terms of like driving on the highway. I live here in Texas. We have all these bypass highways that you get into a town, and you can take a highway that goes around a town, so you don't have to deal with the traffic. And that's a bypass. You're not going through the grit. You're not going through the people. You're not going through the population. You're not going through the businesses. You're not going through the city. And guess what? When you bypass that, you don't experience it. And that which you didn't experience stays with you. So when you can't call forgiveness something that you've not gone through. You can't go around it. You have to go through it. And if you try to go around it, guess what? The thing you thought you got around is now in your front, and it's going to stay with you until you figure out a way or gain the bravery and the courage to actually not take the bypass, but to go through it. And I learned this term from my wife. She grew up Hindu, and she is also a clinical psychologist, so she has street cred in terms of what this looks like on an academic and kind of gritty reality. And she told me about this book, and she used this term, spiritual bypassing. She was using it in a completely different context for me, but it rang my little spidey senses. As someone who's been a pastor for a long time, I've seen this at play so many times. Just people using some sort of religious or spiritual maxim or belief to justify not dealing with reality. How do I not face what's in front of me? How do I not feel the feelings that are coming up inside of me, which is usually anger, sadness, the anxiety, these sorts of feelings? How do I go around them? And we think that solves the problem, but it's really what's actually happening is two things. One, we're kicking the can down the road. It doesn't solve the problem. It's just now going to come up in probably the most inconvenient way possible in your future. And two, it reveals that you are not yet brave. That's what that reveals to me. And I don't mean that to be a judgment. I mean that to be a kind of a observation.
Mm-hmm.
When courage is happening, we move forward in the face of fear. When courage is not happening, we avoid what's in front of us, and we don't deal with it. I don't like to use the word coward, but it applies technically in that sense. So my wife was talking to me about this, and I would argue that in what happens when people are in that instance, why don't you just forgive? People are trying to give what are simple answers for complex problems. They see a calculus problem before them, and they're like, the answer is 3. And maybe the answer is 3, but it might be because they looked in the back of the book, not because they actually worked the problem. You know what I mean? You can get the right answer without actually working the problem. And guess what?
Yeah.
That means you're still stupid. That means you don't know how to work the problem. You're not wise. You haven't grown. You just know the answer without actually working the problem. And I would argue that even for those, where the simple answers work, some people are like, oh, great, the simple answer, and they move forward. I would say they are being actively stunted.
Mm.
and they are not actually spiritually growing. Simple answers are like seeds that spoil. They don't grow into flourishing plants. They fester, and as long as we hold on to them, they make us worse versions of ourselves. This is the drinking the rat poison. This is why this is a
Yeah.
conversation that matters. I'm not interested in providing simple solutions. I don't think that those exist. What I am interested in is helping people experience freedom that can't be attained through very comfortable
Mm.
paths.
You mentioned a few moments ago the idea of sort of kicking the can down the road
Yeah.
and not experiencing and processing something. And it reminds me of something a guy named Brad Blanton said. He's a psychologist. He wrote a book called Radical Honesty, which is, I've read portions of it. It's pretty outstanding. I mean, it's I don't know how I feel about it, but it's got some
It
very
sounds
interesting ideas.
amazing.
Like it's really cool. But one of the things that he talks about, he talks a lot about these spiritual practices of what we might just call practicing presence. And he says if you experience an experience, it comes and it goes. If you resist an experience, it stays.
It
And I
stays.
thought, and that is
Ugh.
so great. Like, if we're going to talk about forgiveness, and if I'm going to get to a place where I can accept that term again, I want it to be in the context in which we acknowledge the importance of the journey of fully experiencing the anger, the rage, the sadness, the loneliness, everything that goes with a bad experience or a harm that's done, going all the way through that and coming out the other side, not bypassing it. You shared a very good analogy related to that. And your analogy about simple answers and the calculus thing is fantastic. But we want to go through things and feel everything, or at least not force ourselves to feel, but be open to whatever comes up, not clenching up, not puckering our butt cheeks, our sphincterizing, letting it pass all the way through our bodies so we can shit it out eventually, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to hold on to the shit. You want to shit it out. And that's the,
Yeah.
you know, the an anatomical equivalent of what we're talking about here. And I think that's super important. So, yeah. Okay. So let's talk about let's kind of get down to like some brass tacks, like not necessarily anecdotes, but kind of sketching out like situations in general that would call for forgiveness. So I think about, and you can add to this or edit or whatever. I think about different situations in which forgiveness might apply. So one would be a wrong is done and it can be made right. So this would include, although this is not exhaustive, but it would include instances of theft, lying, gossip. These are things that are wrongs done, and it's possible for it to be made right. And then
Mhm.
there are other wrongs that are done, and they can't be undone. This would include physical violence, rape, an angry outburst. These are sort of like actions, sort of like the toothpaste analogy. Like once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's not coming back in.
Yep.
You can say you're sorry, but you can't really
Make it go away. You can't.
you can't
Yeah.
make it go away. You can't monetarily, whatever. A third would be a wrongdoer expresses remorse and then asks for forgiveness. And then a last, I'm thinking about a wrongdoer who cannot or will not be accountable. So they won't, meaning they just refuse to acknowledge or be remorseful, or they're dead. You know, there's just nothing they can do. What do you think about these distinctions, Joel? What comes to mind when I mention these things?
I mean, there's so many things. I could talk forever about these things, and I have once again I alluded to. I worked a 12-step program, and I have done the 12 steps. If you have not looked into those and have not actually done those, I'm just talking to those who are listening. It's hard for you to probably appreciate the deep psychological and spiritual surgery those 12 steps do to you. if you do them with like honest intentions. And at some point you take an inventory of yourself, you talk that about with another person, and then there's the part where you make amends, and they use that term, making amends. And sometimes it's difficult because, like you said, how do you make amends to someone that you wronged who's now passed away, who's now
Mm-hmm.
dead?
Mm-hmm.
And 12 steps actually has a lot of you talk about sponsors, and there's this deep wisdom of how do you do this, and why would you do that if someone's already died? Because there's still benefit for the person. There's
Mm-hmm.
still actions that we can do. And what the 12 steps are pointing back to are, I think, are indigenous practices that have
Mm-hmm.
happened throughout the centuries that a lot of indigenous people groups have already discovered. How do
Interesting.
I as a person feel better after I did something shitty?
Mm. Yep.
Or how do I appropriately honor the feelings that I'm feeling rather than spiritually bypassing them? I'm thinking of
Mm.
rituals of grief. I have several friends who are Jewish who have had parents pass away, and there are specific rituals
Mm.
and with specific timelines to
Yeah.
stay in this space, to accept, acknowledge, and even honor your own feelings of grief,
Mm.
rather than
Mm-hmm.
try and push them to the side and go, oh, we're all going to see each other in heaven, which is what most evangelical Christian funerals are like. It's like, oh, this person died 4 days ago. Let's all feel happy now. Like, what the
They're with
fuck?
Jesus, man.
What?
They finally got to go home to Jesus. It's all okay.
It just completely bypasses the human experience of grief. And all it does is make a bunch of people go home. 80% of them go home feeling happy because they actually don't care that that person died. And the other 20% go home feeling confused, going like, I'm supposed to feel happy that they're in heaven, but instead I feel awful that they're no
Mm.
longer with me. And meanwhile,
Mm-hmm.
all those people who showed up at the funeral are gone. They don't
Mm-hmm.
they don't follow the person who's grieving, and that person is left with mixed messages. I'm supposed to feel happy, but instead I feel awful. This is spiritual bypassing at its worst. So when you talk about this, several things
Mm.
come up to me. There's another author other than Everett Worthington, before Everett Worthington, a guy named Lewis Smedes,
Mm.
who's written several books on forgiveness. And I think about a couple quotes from him, and I'm going to read these to you, Trent, and would love to
Mm.
hear any thoughts that you have on
Mm.
them. So quote number one is, forgiving does not erase the bitter past. A healed memory is not a deleted memory. Instead, forgiving what we cannot forget creates a new way to remember. We change the memory of our past into a hope for the future. That's quote number one.
Mm.
That's the most beefy one I'm going to offer you, but I think that's
Mm.
super important. We are not
Mm.
talking about deleting memories. We're not talking about forgetting or sweeping things under the carpet, under the rug, so to speak. The second quote is, you will know that forgiveness has begun when you recall those who hurt you and feel the power to wish them well. Whew. That quote for me has been a fantastic litmus test of when I am actually trying to spiritually bypass a situation, or whether I am really doing the honest, gritty work of facing this shit of someone hurting me. I heard a friend tell me one time when I was going through my divorce, he said, when you're going through hell, keep going. Because hell doesn't last forever, but you have to accept it. You had mentioned, when we try to go around it, it just stays. The phrase I heard from my therapist was, that which you resist will persist.
Mm-hmm.
And so acceptance is really the antidote. And the last quote he says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you, which goes back to the rat poison quote. This is why I think it matters. When we don't forgive, whatever that may mean, there are consequences, and we experience them. We are the ones who suffer.
Yeah, so I would respond to these quotes in a couple ways. One would be regarding the first quote that you shared about forgiveness does not erase the past. A healed memory is not a deleted memory. Instead, forgiving what we cannot forget creates a new way to remember. I think that is a concept that I'm really interested in, and I've found to be helpful too. Is we're not telling ourselves to forget the situation, but processing it, integrating it, forgiving that person allows us to move forward. It's hard to even put into words, but experientially, if you've had that experience, of something that feels like it's been healed up, you can look back and say you still recognize that it was a wrong, it was an evil or an ugliness or a wrong moment, but you know that it's not part of your present. It was part of your past. I think that's a big thing. So I think that's really powerful. The other thing I would say is in the form of a question, and genuinely I don't have the answer to this one, but I think one thing I've said, and this is I'm problematizing these things a little bit here when I say this, that I would wonder what might be the sort of evolutionary function of continuing to have not bitterness and resentment that would really harm your life, but I wonder if there might be times when it's good to still feel very strongly about a certain person who's done not just not gotten mad with you, but if anybody's had somebody who's done something really horrible to them, it's good that you have some kind of strong emotion, whether that's hate or fear, because too many times people, they block and repress what are survival emotions toward a person, and they end up going back and getting involved with that person again because they might say they've forgiven that person. But in fact, what they haven't done, along with the forgiveness process, is, and this would be another podcast, is the importance of establishing a boundary and maintaining that boundary so that might be able to have forgiven that person, but what that person has done is so egregious, and that person has not shown any remorse or any sense of transformation. And so you have to draw that line and maintain it. And one of the ways that you do that is by retaining some of that emotional rawness towards that person. It's a very difficult dance. I don't know exactly how you execute it perfectly, but it is possible to go in that other direction. You think you've forgiven somebody and you think it's all done, and when you forget the horror of what was done to you or somebody else, you may not protect that boundary, which is an equally important, just as forgiveness is important to the extent of letting go of resentment. Maintaining boundaries is important for protecting the integrity of your own well-being. Both things have to be there, and it's extremely hard to do. And unfortunately, in our society, we don't have enough discussions about doing both of those things. It's either all forgiveness, and it's usually cheap forgiveness, or it's all boundaries and it ends up being callous and all these kinds of things. But doing two of those, man, that is hard work, man. It's hard work.
It is. Yeah, it's like the kind of the cliche, it's usually women going back to a relationship where they're being abused.
Yeah.
I forgive him. His behaviors do not show that I should forgive him, but his words, why would I not forgive him? He seems sincere when he's telling me he's going to change. And that's where I think we see these nuances of these extremes. And a lot of people, this is spiritual bypassing at its finest. I am forgiving this person while keeping myself in this cycle of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That if forgiveness leads you to a cycle of suffering, I would argue that's not actually forgiveness. That's not what
Yes.
we're talking about here.
Yeah. And so I had talked about, coming up with adjacent terms to forgiveness, instead of like replacing it, but terms that can supplement it. And I want to introduce, you and I have talked about reparative justice, so I want to introduce terms that are not new, but I like to use, and that is the terms of repair and reinstatement, is just other ways to think about what's going on. So if I have done something wrong, or somebody's done something wrong to me, we should ask ourselves, how can I repair this? How can I make this situation better? It's not. It's this dance, right? If you are the offended person, the opportunity that you have is to process the pain and to um, come to a place of forgiveness. As the offender, my part is not to assume their forgiveness, but to ask myself, how can I do right by this person? I'm not concerned with their obligation to forgive me. I mean, you've seen certain people like, you need to forgive me. It's like, fuck you, man.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
about I'll take care of that? You take care of what you need to do to change your behavior, right?
Yep.
That's the dance here, is both partners involved in this situation. And the other, like reinstatement. And what I would mean by that is, somebody's done something wrong to varying degrees. They have the opportunity to apologize for it and to demonstrate changed behavior so they can earn my trust back and they can be reinstated as a friend, as somebody that I trust, as somebody that I care about. So I like adding these words to the mix, as it were, and creating a more multivalent, robust concept in the galaxy of forgiveness, as it were. It just makes it richer and more meaningful, I think.
I agree with what you're saying there, and it brings up two ideas for me. One comes from some of the most popular literature in the modern world, which is Harry Potter, and I know that you haven't read these, so I'm going to mention these because I know many of our listeners have read them, some who haven't, and if you haven't, like my friend Trent, I'm not going to offer a spoiler alert because by now you should have read it by now, and if
Yes.
you haven't
Yeah.
read it by now, then you clearly don't care. So that's okay. I don't judge you, but I'm going to use this story at the very end.
Right.
At the very end. So it's Harry Potter, right, on one end, and you have Voldemort, he who must not be named, who is the epitome of evil, this powerful evil wizard who had been doing very dark magic, splitting his soul through the act of murder. And when he murders, he splits his soul and he puts pieces of his souls into physical pieces of physical I don't know what the word is, just objects. And these are called horcruxes. And when Harry and Voldemort are at the very end, Harry has destroyed all the Horcruxes. So now, if Voldemort gets killed, he no longer has a piece of his soul that's tying him to existence. And what he says, to the only way to undo a Horcrux in the academic vernacular of this world of J.K. Rowling, Harry looks at Voldemort and says, "Before we go down this road," and Harry, this is their final showdown. He says, "Try for a bit of remorse, because that's the antidote to all that Voldemort has been doing. Try for the only way to undo these Horcruxes is remorse." And the line, I think the exact line is from Harry, like, "Be a man, try for some remorse." And Voldemort's like, "You dare, you dare." He's just so arrogant and blind. But I think that's what that is. It is so important to call that out. There are those who don't care to reinstate. They don't care to repair. What does forgiveness look like in this world where there are people doing legitimate evil? I think that's important. There are
Mm,
people that are experiencing legitimate evil at the hands of people
mm,
who should not be trusted. They should not. There's zero reason we should trust them. So I think it's important to distinguish between, and Lewis Meads is who I just offered those quotes. He's the one who helped me see this distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. When there's a harm in a relationship, there's a wedge. Forgiveness is not about reconciliation. They're different. Like, to forgive does not mean that I have to trust that person again. Forgiveness is in the camp of my decision how I'm going to treat that person. That the treat is not the same as trust. It means I will be cordial, or I will not become a person that I don't want to be with that person. It means that I am focusing on what's on my side of the street, to say in 12 steps language. And it certainly doesn't mean that I need to be in relationship with them. But if I do want to be in relationship with them, if I want to even go to that point where that conversation, which is I'm going to argue is a secondary conversation, maybe a tertiary conversation
mm.
of what it means to repair and restore, forgiveness is the prerequisite. You cannot get there without forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean I have to go there, because forgiveness might mean this person still is an untrustworthy bastard that I should keep at arm's length. Wisdom would be to not be in relationship with that person, but I can still forgive them. Those are two separate issues. That's how I would talk about it.
Well, Joel, I want to thank you for quite a lot of meaningful thoughts and well-researched contribution to the discussion. You've definitely added to my understanding and my ongoing sort of dispute with the term forgiveness. But I think this has been really interesting. Definitely stuff to continue thinking about. At least I speak for myself. So anyway, thanks a lot for that. Is there anything else to add in closing?
I think it's fair for us, Trent, and I say to you and to our listeners, pain is real. Like, I know what it's like to have feelings of betrayal. I know what it's like to have adults when I was a child, peers when I was a child, who caused pain and harm to my life. I know it's like, as an adult, to have trusted individuals and to find that trust was not well placed. I know those feelings. And ultimately, what my hope is for myself and for others is that I am not a victim of life. I don't have to sit in a space of going like, everything is happening to me. Instead, I have choices. There's a menu in front of me. There's not one choice. There's a menu of choices. And one of them is to pursue forgiveness, not for the sake of trusting a person who's untrustworthy, but instead for the sake of my personal freedom and finding out what the best version of myself is.
Fantastic. Yeah. We're talking about emotional growth and emotional maturity. We're talking about fully experiencing life, and it's a very, very hard topic because this process requires a lot of us, and there's so many sort of wrong ways you can go, and it requires courage. So anyway, thank you guys for sticking with us in a kind of a heavy conversation, but one that I think is good for us to have and productive. So thanks for being with us. You can find us at leadballoonspod.com. You can find us at our YouTube channel, Lead Balloons Podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and you can email us at leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. With that being said, we're done with another episode of Lev Lynn's The Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions.
Peace, my friends.